For about 100 years, Sweden was the country every king in Europe was afraid of. Not Spain, not France, Sweden. A cold, half-empty land of farmers and forests at the top of the map suddenly started winning wars against everyone, sometimes against three enemies at once, and they kept on winning. They stomped the Holy Roman Empire. They humiliated Denmark. They marched all the way into Poland, into Germany, into Russia. At its peak, the Swedish Empire stretched across the Baltic Sea, swallowed up parts of modern-day Norway, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and even chunks of Germany. Their kings were treated like military gods. Their armies were copied by every major power on the continent, and then almost overnight it was gone. No invasion wiped them off the map. No plague flattened the country. They just stopped. Sweden quietly stepped off the stage and decided to never come back. So how does a thinly populated country on the freezing edge of Europe become the most feared military machine of its age? And what happens when a nation gives up superpower status on purpose? To answer that, we have to go back to a time when Sweden wasn't even properly Sweden. It was a poor, rural backwater stuck inside a kingdom run by someone else. Around the year 1520, Sweden was part of something called the Kalmar Union, a sort of awkward three-way marriage between Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, all ruled from Copenhagen by a Danish king. Most Swedes hated it. They paid taxes to a foreign court, took orders from foreign nobles, and watched the best jobs in their own country go to Danes. And then the Danish king did something so unbelievably stupid that he basically invented Swedish independence by accident. His name was Christian II, and in November 1520 he invited the leading nobles, bishops, and citizens of Stockholm to a peace banquet inside the royal castle. Wine, speeches, smiles, the works. Then he locked the doors. Over the next 3 days, his men dragged about 80 of the most important people in Sweden out into the main square and chopped their heads off. Today it's remembered as the Stockholm bloodbath, and it set off everything that followed. One young Swedish noble had been out of town when the executions happened. His name was Gustav Vasa, and his father's head had just rolled across that square. Gustav Vasa was 24 years old, broke, and very much wanted by the Danish king. He'd actually been a hostage in Denmark a couple of years earlier and had escaped by disguising himself and slipping across the border. Now, with his father dead and most of the Swedish nobility executed, he was basically the last man standing who could rally a rebellion. The only problem was that nobody wanted to rebel. He rode north into a region called Dalarna, a tough mining province full of stubborn farmers who already had a reputation for not taking orders from anyone. He stood up in town squares and told them what the Danish king had done in Stockholm. Their wine, their banquets, their 80 severed heads. The farmers listened politely and then told him to go away. They didn't want a war they couldn't win. Gustav, completely out of options, gave up and started skiing toward the Norwegian border to live in exile. So I'm done. Nobody wants to fight. You can't just leave. The Danes will hunt you down anyway. I tried. I gave speeches. Nobody cared. Then the news caught up with him. The Danish king had just raised taxes again and started hunting down the families of the men he'd already killed. 2 skiers chased Gustav down before he reached the border and dragged him back. The farmers had changed their minds. Within months, he had an army of miners, peasants, and small-time nobles, and they started taking castles one by one. By 1523, the Danes were pushed out completely, and Gustav Vasa was crowned king of an independent Sweden. Now came the hard part. Sweden was bankrupt. The treasury was empty, the army was a collection of farmers with axes, and the Catholic Church owned about a fifth of all the land in the country. Gustav looked at that church wealth and basically said, "Problem solved." He converted Sweden to Lutheranism, seized every monastery, every silver chalice, every plot of church-owned farmland, and pumped it all into the crown. Almost overnight, Sweden went from broke to solvent. He spent the next 30 years on the throne building roads, organizing a real tax system, and crushing every rebellion that popped up. By the time he died in 1560, Sweden was no longer a backwater. It was a small, focused, well-organized kingdom with a hungry military and a very specific neighbor in mind. That neighbor was Denmark. The two countries had been swinging at each other for centuries, and now that Sweden was independent, the rivalry only got worse. Denmark controlled the entrance to the Baltic Sea, which meant every Swedish ship that wanted to trade with the rest of Europe had to sail past Danish guns and pay Danish tolls. It was a chokehold, and the Danes weren't shy about squeezing. For the next several decades, Sweden's kings poured money into one thing above all else: the army. Gustav Vasa's sons and grandsons fought wars against Denmark, Poland, and Russia, sometimes winning, sometimes losing badly, but always learning. They built fortresses, they trained conscripts from every village, they hired foreign mercenaries to teach their officers the latest tactics from the wars sweeping Europe. By the early 1600s, Sweden had something almost no other country had: a national army drawn from its own population, loyal to its own king, paid on time, and drilled constantly. Then, in 1611, a 17-year-old kid inherited the throne. His name was Gustavus Adolphus, and he would turn Sweden into a monster. You're 17, I'm aware. We're at war with Denmark, Russia, and Poland simultaneously. Also aware. Do you have a plan? I have several. They mostly involve winning. He was tall, blonde, fluent in something like 7 languages, and absolutely obsessed with military reform. Most European armies of the time were slow, clumsy, and built around heavy infantry blocks called tercios, big squares of pikemen with a few musketeers stuffed in for flavor. They hit hard, but moved like glaciers. Gustavus Adolphus threw the whole concept out. He made his infantry units smaller, faster, and more flexible. He mixed musketeers and pikemen in thinner lines so more guns could fire at once. He standardized the muskets so any soldier could grab any weapon and know how to use it. He made his artillery lighter, mounted it on better carriages, and pushed it right up to the front lines where it could actually hurt people. He also did something nobody else bothered with. He drilled his men constantly, reloading, marching, switching formations, firing in volleys. By the time a Swedish soldier saw his first real battle, he'd already done the motions thousands of times. When the shooting started, his hands moved on their own. Then in 1630, Gustavus Adolphus loaded his army onto ships and sailed for Germany. Germany at that point was a nightmare. The 30 Years' War had been grinding on for 12 years, and it was the worst war Europe had ever seen. It started as a religious fight between Protestants and Catholics inside the Holy Roman Empire, then mutated into a giant free-for-all where everyone with an army showed up to grab land, loot villages, and settle scores. Whole regions of Germany were depopulated. Soldiers burned crops, peasants starved, mercenaries switched sides for better pay, and the Catholic side, led by the Holy Roman Emperor, was winning. Hard. The Protestant princes of northern Germany were on the verge of total collapse. They sent desperate letters to anyone who might help. The French were Catholic, but hated the emperor and quietly offered to fund a Protestant champion. The Dutch were busy fighting Spain. The English were broke and confused. Then a fleet of ships appeared on the Baltic coast, and out marched 13,000 Swedish soldiers led by a king who was about to rearrange the map of Europe. So the Swedes are here. How many? 13,000 to start. Maury coming. 13,000. The emperor has 100,000 men in the field. Yes, but apparently these ones know how to shoot. The Catholic generals were not impressed. Sweden was a small country at the edge of nowhere. Their king was young, their army was small, and they were a long way from home. The emperor's top commander, a man named Tilly, had been winning battles for 40 years. He'd crushed every Protestant army that crossed his path. The Swedes would be no different. They met at a town called Breitenfeld in September 1631. Tilly arranged his army in the old Spanish style, huge dense blocks of pikemen, slow but devastating if they caught you. Gustavus Adolphus laid out his army in his new way, thin flexible lines bristling with muskets and small mobile cannons spread along the front. When the two armies collided, the Swedish line bent but didn't break. Then it started firing, volley after volley after volley, 3 times faster than anything Tilly's men had ever faced. The Swedish cannons, the ones nobody thought could move fast enough to matter, kept up with the infantry and tore holes in the Catholic blocks. By sundown, Tilly's army was destroyed. 7,000 dead, 6,000 captured, the rest scattered into the forests. Europe went into shock. Overnight, Gustavus Adolphus went from a curiosity to the most famous man in Europe. Pamphlets about him flew off printing presses from London to Venice. Protestant preachers called him the Lion of the North, a king sent by God to save them. Catholic priests called him the Antichrist. Either way, everyone agreed on one thing. This Swedish farm boy with the funny accent had just rewritten the rules of war. He didn't stop. He marched south through Germany, town after town opening its gates to him, Protestant princes flocking to his banner. He took Munich. He took Mainz. He pushed into the Catholic heartland and made the Holy Roman Emperor genuinely consider running for it. Swedish soldiers, who had grown up in villages where a good year meant nobody starved, were now drinking Bavarian wine in palaces they couldn't even pronounce. How far south are we now? We're in Bavaria, sir. Bavaria. I've never even seen a real mountain before this campaign. There's one outside the tent. I know. It keeps surprising me. The Emperor scrambled. He pulled his best general out of retirement, a strange, paranoid, brilliant man named Wallenstein, and gave him a blank check to raise an army big enough to crush the Swedes. Wallenstein built it from nothing in months. Mercenaries from every corner of Europe, drawn by the promise of loot and steady pay. By late 1632, he had something like 60,000 men, and he marched them straight at Gustavus Adolphus. The two armies met in November at a place called Lutzen, in fog so thick the soldiers couldn't see 30 feet in front of them. The battle was chaos from the first minute. Cavalry charges disappearing into the mist, regiments firing at shapes they couldn't identify, officers riding the wrong direction and getting shot by their own side. Gustavus Adolphus, leading a cavalry charge personally because that was apparently the kind of king he was, got separated from his bodyguards in the fog. A pistol shot hit him in the arm, then another in the back. He fell from his horse, was stabbed by an enemy soldier who didn't know who he was, and died face down in the mud. The Swedes didn't even know their king was dead until hours later. They kept fighting. They actually won the battle. But the man who had built the machine was gone. His daughter Christina was 6 years old. Sweden was suddenly a superpower run by a kindergartner. A council of advisors, led by an extremely capable man named Axel Oxenstierna, took over the actual governing while the army kept fighting in Germany. And here's the strange part. It worked. Sweden didn't collapse. The war machine Gustavus Adolphus had built was so well organized, so deeply drilled, that it kept rolling forward even without him. Swedish armies stayed in Germany for 16 more years, fighting battle after battle, occasionally losing one, but winning most. By the time the 30 Years' War finally ended in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia, Sweden walked out of the negotiations with a massive prize. They got chunks of northern Germany, control of the mouths of the biggest rivers flowing into the Baltic, and a permanent seat at the table of European great powers. The Baltic Sea was now basically a Swedish lake. So we won. We won a lot, actually. How much of Germany do we own now? Pomerania, Bremen, Verden, Wismar region, bits and pieces. And the king is still 6. The king is 22 and she's a queen. Right, that. Christina was a strange ruler. Brilliant, fluent in half a dozen languages, obsessed with philosophy. She invited the famous French thinker René Descartes to Stockholm to tutor her, then accidentally killed him by scheduling lessons at 5 in the morning in a freezing palace. Descartes caught pneumonia and died within months. Christina, for her part, started losing interest in being queen at all. She secretly converted to Catholicism, which was a huge problem since Sweden was the Protestant champion of Europe, and in 1654 she did something nobody saw coming. She abdicated, just walked away from the throne, rode out of Sweden in men's clothing, and went to live in Rome. Her cousin Karl X took over and immediately did what Swedish kings of this era did best. He went to war. This time the target was Poland, which was going through a rough patch of internal chaos. Karl X marched in and started winning so fast and so thoroughly that the campaign got its own name in Polish history, the Deluge. Swedish troops swept across Poland, occupied Warsaw, occupied Krakow, and basically broke the Polish state in half. Then winter came, and Karl X decided to march his army across a frozen sea. Denmark had jumped into the war thinking Sweden was too busy in Poland to defend itself. It was a reasonable guess. It was also completely wrong. Karl X turned his army around, marched it across Germany at terrifying speed, and arrived at the Danish border in the middle of one of the coldest winters anyone could remember. The Baltic Sea, which normally separated Denmark's main islands from the mainland, had frozen solid. Most generals would have looked at that ice and decided to wait until spring. Karl X looked at it and saw a road. In January 1658, he marched his entire army, cavalry, infantry, cannons and all, straight across the frozen sea. 12,000 men walking on ice with the salt water creaking beneath their boots. They crossed one belt of frozen sea, then another, then another. Horses fell through. Cannons fell through. The army kept going. The ice is cracking, sir. I can hear it. We've lost 2 cannons already. We'll buy new ones in Copenhagen. When they appeared outside Copenhagen, the Danish king genuinely thought he was hallucinating. There was no army supposed to be there. There couldn't be an army there. The sea was in the way. Denmark surrendered within weeks. The treaty that followed handed Sweden a huge chunk of southern Scandinavia, including the provinces of Skane, Blekinge, and Halland, which had been Danish for centuries and would now be Swedish forever. The map of Scandinavia was redrawn on a frozen sea. By the 1660s, the Swedish Empire had hit its absolute peak. It controlled the Baltic, owned huge parts of Germany, ruled Finland, ruled Estonia and Latvia, and had just permanently humiliated Denmark. For a country with maybe 1.5 million people against neighbors with 5, 10, 20 times that population, it was an absurd achievement. Every other European power studied Swedish military reforms. French, Prussian, Russian, and Dutch officers came to Sweden to learn how it was done. But here's the thing about empires built almost entirely on military skill. They work as long as you keep winning. The moment you stop, the whole structure starts to look very fragile because the population was small, the treasury was always thin, and the territories were spread out across hundreds of miles of coastline that other countries badly wanted back. All it would take was one Swedish king making one big mistake. That king was about to be born. His name was Karl XII, and he inherited the throne in 1697 at the age of 15. He was serious, devout, didn't drink, didn't chase women, and was absolutely obsessed with becoming a great warrior king like his ancestors. Within 3 years of taking the crown, he got his wish. Denmark, Poland, and Russia all looked at the teenage king of Sweden and decided this was their chance to take back everything they'd lost over the past century. They formed a secret alliance and attacked simultaneously in 1700. 3 enemies, 3 fronts, 1 teenager, so they all attacked at once. Yes, sire. How old is the Russian Tsar? 27, sire. And the Polish king? 39. So I'm the youngest. Yes, sire. Good. They won't expect what I'm about to do. What he did was probably the most aggressive opening campaign in European military history. He hit Denmark first, landing troops on its coast within months and forcing the Danes to surrender before they'd even properly started fighting. Then he sailed across the Baltic with 8,000 soldiers to deal with the Russians, who had invaded Swedish Estonia with a force of around 35,000 and were besieging a town called Narva. He arrived in November during a blinding snowstorm. The snow was blowing directly into the Russian lines and directly behind the Swedish advance. Karl XII charged through the blizzard with his small army and smashed into the Russian camp before they even realized he was there. The Russian army, 4 times the size of his, broke completely. Thousands surrendered. The teenage king had just destroyed a force, outnumbering him 4-1 in a single afternoon. Europe lost its mind all over again. A new lion of the north, another Gustavus Adolphus. Pamphlets, portraits, songs, the whole circus. Karl XII spent the next several years marching around Poland, deposing the Polish king, installing a new one he liked better, and basically treating Eastern Europe as his personal chessboard. By 1707, he had defeated 2 of his 3 enemies completely and was at the height of his power. That left Russia. The Russian Tsar, a young man named Peter, had spent the years since Narva quietly rebuilding. He'd visited Western Europe, studied shipbuilding in Holland, drafted thousands of peasants into a modern army, and waited. He was not the same Peter who had lost at Narva. He was the one who would later be called Peter the Great. Karl XII decided to invade Russia. It was the worst decision any Swedish king ever made. Karl XII marched east in 1707 with about 40,000 of the best soldiers in Europe. The plan was to push straight to Moscow, force Peter to surrender, and end the war in one campaign. The Russians had a different plan. They retreated. Every village the Swedes approached, the Russians burned to the ground first. Every barn, every grain store, every well poisoned or destroyed. The Swedish army marched deeper and deeper into Russia and found nothing to eat, nothing to loot, nothing but empty fields and ash. Then winter arrived, and not just any winter. The winter of 1708 to 1709 was the coldest Europe had seen in 500 years. Birds froze in midair and dropped out of the sky. Wine froze in barrels. Swedish soldiers, exhausted and starving, froze to death by the thousands in their sleep. By spring, Karl XII's army had been cut roughly in half before he'd even fought a real battle. How many men do we have left? About 20,000 fit to fight. We started with 40. I'm aware. We can still win. Peter is one battle away from collapse. Sire, we are one battle away from collapse. In June 1709, what was left of the Swedish army met the Russians at a town in Ukraine called Poltava. Karl XII had been shot in the foot a few days earlier and had to be carried into the battle on a stretcher. His best general was sick. His artillery had been left behind because there were no horses left alive to pull it. The Russians had 3 times his numbers, fresh troops and plenty of cannons. The battle lasted a few hours. The Swedish army was annihilated. Thousands killed, thousands captured, the rest scattered. Karl XII himself escaped south with a handful of men and ended up stranded in the Ottoman Empire for 5 years, basically a guest who refused to leave. Back home, Sweden's enemies looked at what had just happened and realized the spell was broken. Denmark re-entered the war. Russia kept pushing. Prussia joined in. The German territories Sweden had held for 60 years started falling one by one. By the time Karl XII finally made it home in 1715, his empire was crumbling around him. He kept fighting anyway, launched a desperate invasion of Norway in 1718, and during the siege of a small fortress, a bullet hit him in the head. Nobody is entirely sure where the bullet came from. Norwegian defenders, maybe, or one of his own officers, exhausted by 20 years of endless war and ready for it to be over. The investigation got nowhere. What everyone agreed on was the result. The king who had carried the whole empire on his shoulders was dead, and the empire died with him. The treaties that followed, signed in 1719, 1720, and finally 1721, dismantled Sweden piece by piece. The German territories went to Prussia and Hanover. Estonia, Latvia, and Ingria went to Russia. Finland was briefly occupied, then handed back. The Baltic Sea, once almost a Swedish lake, now had a brand new naval power sitting on its eastern shore. Peter the Great founded a city on the territory he'd taken from Sweden and called it St. Petersburg. Russia had replaced Sweden as the great power of the north, and it would stay there for the next 300 years. So we're not an empire anymore. We're not. What are we then? We're Sweden. The country that came out the other side was exhausted. A whole generation of young men was dead in fields stretching from Ukraine to Norway. The treasury was empty. The population had shrunk. And the Swedish parliament, which had been quietly losing power to the kings for a century, suddenly took most of it back. The era that followed was actually called the Age of Liberty. The kings became ceremonial. The nobles bickered. The country turned inward and started doing something almost no other European nation was doing. It stopped going to war. There were a couple of small attempts to recover lost territory later in the 1700s. All of them failed. By the early 1800s, after one last disastrous war that cost Sweden Finland to Russia, the country made a decision that's still in place today. No more alliances. No more foreign wars. Sweden would be neutral. It held that line through Napoleon, through the First World War, through the Second World War, through the entire Cold War. The country that had once terrified Europe quietly became famous for furniture, pop music, and meatballs. The Swedish Empire didn't vanish because someone destroyed it. It vanished because the Swedes themselves looked at the cost of being feared and decided it wasn't worth it anymore. If you found this story interesting, you'll probably enjoy the one about how Switzerland turned neutrality into a superpower of its own.